Our first speaker tonight is Medea Benjamin. She's the founding director of Global Exchange. She accompanied the delegation to Afghanistan. Previously, she had led women's delegation to Afghanistan and Pakistan to investigate human rights and to talk to women's groups about their role in a transition government. She has worked and traveled widely on behalf of human rights and social justice issues for more than 20 years. And she also ran for Senate on the Green Party ticket. So I'd like to welcome Medea Benjamin.
We just got back last night, so this is our first chance to talk to people about what we did and what we saw. It's really just a pleasure to come back and be able to exchange with you what was one of the most profound experiences probably of our lives. I had gone to Pakistan and to the border of Afghanistan at the end of November, the beginning of December, to look into the issue of humanitarian aid and whether that aid was getting to the people who needed it. But in the course of investigating that, we just kept coming upon people who told us the stories about their relatives being killed by the US bombing. And we came across all kinds of people who had been injured in the bombing, who didn't have access to medical care, whose homes had been destroyed, didn't have anywhere to go. And we were saying, why isn't this story getting out? Why aren't we hearing about the Afghan victims who are every bit as innocent as the September 11th victims? So we started taking down some of their stories and came back to the United States and tried to tell those stories. And went to Washington, D.C., and we held a press conference, and no press showed up. And we went around knocking on the offices and the doors in the press club in Washington, D.C., and literally got the response of the press saying, if you are here to tell us that the United States is part of the problem in Afghanistan, we just don't want to hear it, and got the doors shut in our faces. And we kept thinking something is terribly wrong, and if we are indeed in a war against terrorism, then isn't part of that war to recognize the humanity of all people, and to recognize that the loss of innocent lives in Afghanistan is every bit as tragic as the loss of lives of our own families, our own people. And if we don't make that clear to ourselves, and especially to people in the Muslim world, however are we going to feel safe? However are we going to build the real foundations for peace? And so I just kept trying to think, how are we going to get this message out? And it occurred to me that the only people who really have the legitimacy to talk about this in a way that the media and the public would listen is people who suffered profound losses themselves on September 11th. And the question then became, how are we going to find some people who are willing to travel thousands of miles away in the midst of their own grief to go to a place that is extremely unsafe to listen to these stories? So we started calling around as Global Exchange, which is a human rights organization based in San Francisco, to people that we had heard about in the press or had talked to who knew people who had lost relatives on September 11th. And some of the responses, this was right about Christmas time, was, it's a great idea, but we just can't do it. Our family is too distraught. I am too distraught. It's too dangerous. We would like to do it, but maybe 6 months from now. It was hard to find people who could make that kind of a trip. But we kept pursuing it because it just seemed so absolutely critical to do, and to do as quickly as possible, because we knew that the US was already looking to the next place to bomb. And if we didn't unwrap that horrible word of collateral damage and start looking really at what it means to people, it makes it so much easier to go and bomb the next place: Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, Iraq. We also know how fickle the media is, and that the Afghanistan story would get old very quickly and they would move on to the next place. So we kept insisting and calling people. And some of the people you'll hear tonight are the people who ended up going on this extraordinary trip. And in fact, the first person to absolutely commit to going is Rita Lasar. when I talked to everybody else, their first question was, how dangerous is it? When I talked to Rita, her first question is, can I smoke? She says she's become much more of a chain smoker after a September 11th. And, but Rita knew from the minute we talked how important this trip was. And she said, if it's just you and Medea, and me, Medea, I'm going to go. And it was thanks to Rita that we got the group together. It was an extraordinary group, and in fact, Rita talked to a man on the West Coast who we were trying to convince to go, a man named Derrill Bodley, who lives in Stockton, California, and had lost his daughter on the United Flight 93 that went down over Pennsylvania. And he wanted to go and didn't want to go, and was concerned about his own health. He had just been hospitalized, thinking he had a heart attack, but it was really the stress of losing his daughter. His wife didn't want him to go, and something in him knew that this was what his 20-year-old daughter would have wanted him to do. And it was Rita calling him and talking to him that convinced him that yes, he should go. And his stepdaughter, Ava Rupp, went with us as well. And then the fourth person in the delegation, who you will hear tonight, is an extraordinary young woman, Kelly Campbell, who lost her brother-in-law in the Pentagon. And Kelly's husband, Barry Amundsen, is also with us here tonight. So it ended up being four very, very wonderful, extraordinary people who went on this trip, who bonded and became family during this trip, and who shared their grief and their suffering with people who have suffered tremendously, not just in the US bombing, but over 23 years of war. One of the most amazing things about this trip was that the press did want to cover it. And in fact, our problem was just the opposite problem we had on the earlier trip, in that we were mobbed by the press. We were mobbed by the press from the moment we left Rita's apartment in New York City on our way to the airport. We had 6 camera crews waiting for us at the airport. When we got into Afghanistan, which was a long, arduous trip, I must say, because there are no commercial flights into Kabul, we had to take a UN plane from Islamabad, Pakistan. But when we got there, we were just mobbed on the airport as soon as we landed by press that included ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, TV stations from around the world wanted to hear the story. I should say that the only TV station that wanted to hear our story when we went the first time was Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was there waiting for us this time as well. We had press everywhere we went, because people in the press understood that this was a way to personalize it. This was a way to, quote, sell the story to their editors. And it became a way to really show people around the world that there were Americans who cared about the lives of Afghan people. So from day one, we really had a chance to bond with the Afghan people. And I'll leave the personal stories to Kelly and to Rita to talk about. But I do want to say that one of the things that struck us the most was that these are people who were so poor to begin with, and then after the bombing campaign had absolutely nowhere to turn to say, where do I get medical care? How do I get money to rebuild my home? And one of the things we are most concerned about is, one, doing a real study on who was killed, why they were killed. We found that there were more casualties, certainly in this war, than there were in the Balkans war. And this is when we are using twice as many, quote, smart bombs than we used in the last war. Why do so many of the smart bombs go astray? And why does the US continue to use cluster bombs at a time when the entire human rights community all over the world puts landmines and cluster bombs in the same category and says they are not legitimate weapons of war because they stay behind long after the war is over, and they tend to kill mostly civilians, mostly farmers, mostly children? And that's certainly what we found with the cluster bombs that the US dropped during this campaign. So we want a study done by the US government of why so many innocent Afghans were killed. The numbers are not known. Some of you might have seen the study done by the University of New Hampshire professor Mark Harold, who says that over 4,000 civilians were killed during the U.S. bombing campaign in Afghanistan. That would be more than the people who were killed on September 11th. There's another study that was done by the Center on Defense Alternatives that said that the number was more around 1,000 or 1,300, but said that was the study that came out and said that many more people were killed per bomb during this war than the Balkans War. So we don't know the exact numbers, and the problem is that the U.S. government refuses to talk about civilian casualties, refuses to give out any numbers at all. So one of the things we are saying is there must be a study done that tells us the number of civilians and, again, why so many were killed. And the other thing is to set up a fund to help them. Because as the people who will speak here tonight told the people of Afghanistan, they were overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, financial, emotional, that they got from people in this country and around the world when they lost their relatives. And we feel that the people of Afghanistan who lost their relatives should get that same kind of compassion and kindness and love and financial support that we are giving to, quote, our own. So that is the purpose that we have now that we are back. We are exhausted, but we are continuing. We will be going tomorrow evening to Washington and spending several days with meetings upon meetings with our congresspeople in Washington to ask them to please help to set up this Afghan Victims Fund.